John Urry, who is a British sociologist from Lancaster University, would say that we live in a global stage. And on a global stage, cities compete. And they compete with the various forms of spectacles, biennales, cultural capitals, World Cups, Olympic Games. And cities do compete in a way in which they bring flows of global capital to their territories and to their industries and to their institutions. So the city, which is a cultural capital, is obviously measuring the impact of such program on their, culture and economy. And many cities, through the program of the cultural, as a cultural capital, actually put themselves on a map of Europe, virtually, because many of those cities have been really not very well known. Obviously, we can talk about Bilbao effect beside the cultural capital, or Manifesta, it's another European cultural exhibition project, or Documenta, or Expo, or other kind of big cultural events. So the perception of the city and the presence of the city, simply if you count the Google as a search machine, you'll see that with the cultural capital program, the number of the Google, items which would relate to a particular city would go exponentially like this. So it's clearly a strong propaganda project as well. Perhaps not the propaganda in terms of maybe old East socialist terms as a kind of political propaganda, but as a sort of, cultural propaganda, not now anymore perhaps ideological or on a level of state, but on a level of the city. But here we have another phenomenon which is super interesting, that cities today are perhaps more important and more powerful than the states. That actually states, in many ways, are much weaker than their capital cities. And that the economy which is generated in a particular city is higher almost than the economy of the state, or at least in percentage. So cities do really compete, but when we studied with Saskia Sassen and Ronald Wall, which are kind of urban economists, the performance of the cities in Europe, then what you understand is that the city is performing well as it will have more links with other cities. And when you create a program like a cultural capital, then inevitably the number of links, the number of lines, which you can draw on a geographical map between your city with other cities will increase. And that is giving to the city more power, more energy, and more economic prosperity. Kees Christianse, who is a Dutch planner and architect, became a professor 5 years ago at ETH Zurich, And 3 years ago, he organized a very interesting, actually, seminar about mid-sized European cities. And he invited planners, politicians, architects, and a couple of us from the academia to discuss a kind of character, the future, the qualities, and the properties of mid-sized European cities. And if I can remember, it's been Bilbao as one of the cities, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, Zurich, Zagreb as the cities. So he would argue, Christianse, that mid-sized European cities still kind of resist the radical globalization, that they still preserve the original value of the European way of life, that their size is right size or proper size for a European way of living, however we, sort of defined European way of living. But obviously the way of living in which you do not to travel a lot to the city center, the way in which you relate to your environment as a recognizable entity, the way in which you construct your personal and your family relations, the way in which you are in a proximity of the nature due to the rather small sizes of the city, and the way in which you use perhaps infrastructure in a way to go to the centers or to commute to the different cities. So having said all of that, I kind of believe that this is all true, but what is true as well, that that those cities do lack something what then Kohlhaas would call a kind of critical mass. That often they do lack a sort of possibilities and potentials to develop something, shall I say, extraordinary, something in a cultural or economic or even social sense unique, that still such extraordinary or special or particular events are usually happening in a more metropolitan, global, multinational, multicultural clusters like Berlin or perhaps Moscow or Istanbul or Paris.